Blood seeped through the light cloth of her ripped gown before she even realized she was wounded. Rose Mallister didn't sense the warmth of the sun on her flesh. She didn't notice the grit digging into her knees. What gripped her was dread, a fierce, piercing dread that latched onto her chest as fiercely as the contusion on her side. Her father had thrust her from the home just an hour prior. His gaze was foggy from liquor, his breath reeked of whiskey. He bellowed that she was the final asset he had to barter. He bellowed that unless she wed Caleb Price this very day, he would forfeit the homestead, the dwelling, and even the privilege of resting eternally on his own soil. Rose pleaded with him to cease, her voice trembling softly. He slapped her cheek, his hand shaking with rage. The crack reverberated in the deserted courtyard, so she fled. She had snatched the little kitchen blade on her exit and the sole item she could manage. Shoeless, partially clad, gasping through her sobs, she dashed until her limb quivered like slender twigs in a gale. Her right sole twisted awkwardly as she attempted to leap across a slim furrow. A sudden snap raced up her shin. Her joint buckled beneath her. She cried into the breeze, her scream raw and desperate, but nobody caught it. Yet she inched onward, yet she struggled to propel herself ahead, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Her sight hazed, but she persisted, because she sensed the fellows Caleb dispatched were lurking somewhere in pursuit. She had overheard them yelling sooner. She understood what they might inflict if they seized her. You ever ponder how panic can drive a soul beyond what optimism ever might? The timber barrier before her seemed like deliverance. All she required was one final surge of vigor. She clutched the upper slat, her fingers aching with effort. Her digits slid. A rusted spike caught the edge of her gown and tore across her flank. The material split. Her hide split alongside it. Warm crimson trickled down her thigh. She tumbled to the far side of the barrier. Her air escaped in a fractured whimper. The earth whirled. Golden weeds melted into azure heavens. She murmured for aid, her tone fracturing into a plea. In front of her loomed a spread. A modest timber portal, vast meadow, a shed slanting like an elder weary of upright posture. If she could attain it, perhaps a soul within would rescue her. Perhaps a soul would detect her prior to Caleb's crew. She hauled herself over the soil, her nails scraping the dirt. Her shredded gown adhered to her body. Her joint pulsed with each measure she advanced. Crimson dripped from her flank and saturated the earth trailing her. When she at last attained the portal, her form surrendered. Her limbs collapsed. Her face met the hotted soil. The heavens faded at the borders. She glimpsed a figure approaching her. Lofty, wide-shouldered, brim drawn low. A silhouette against the scorching orb. She breathed one final plea before obscurity engulfed her, her lips barely moving. She breathed, "Please." The unknown figure halted beside her. He gazed upon the shoeless lass hemorrhaging in his earth, his brow furrowing slightly, and he extended for her, his movements careful and sure. That solitary, straightforward decision was poised to alter both their existences in manners neither could foresee. But who was this fellow she crumpled before, and what choice would he render regarding a fleeing bride hemorrhaging at his threshold? Rose stirred to the sensation of calloused palms elevating her, firm and reliable, nothing akin to the palms that had inflicted pain earlier. Her lids fluttered ajar. Daylight pierced them. For an instant she couldn't remember where she was. Then she sensed wood under her spine, a level surface, rigid, heated from the daylight, and a man towering over her, as broad as a shed entrance, with a shadow that veiled half her frame. Her pulse hammered in her chest. She attempted to rise, but the ache of her joint yanked her straight back, a sharp hiss escaping her lips. The gentleman laid a seasoned hand near her collar, tender yet resolute. "Just rest easy, please," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. His timbre was deep, unwavering, like one who endured tempests and outlasted each. Rose blinked once more, striving to sharpen her view. His visage was weathered, whiskers cropped brief, creases near his eyes etched eras of toil and extended hours beneath the Kansas blaze. He resembled someone the terrain had molded. Fellows like that seldom invite discord into their abodes, and they certainly don't aid unknowns without cause. Then he uttered, his tone matter-of-fact, "Let me see your souls." Her face flushed crimson. She had never heard an unfamiliar man declare such, particularly as she lay semi-aware on his surface, gown rent at the flank. But the throb in her joint recalled she possessed no dignity remaining to guard. He elevated the fringe of her gown scarcely enough to view her joint. The puffiness had swelled unsightly and violet. She recoiled as his digits nudged softly against the structure, wincing quietly. "Not fractured, just wrenched severely," he said. His timbre remained composed, almost overly so for a gentleman contacting the soul of a wounded unknown. She observed him extend toward her flank, toward the gash the spike had wrought. The instant his palm neared the lesion, her alarm flared. She lurched upright, seized the petite blade concealed in her rent gown, and directed it squarely at his torso, her hand trembling with fear. Elias seized her forearm before the edge grazed his attire, resolute enough to halt her, yet mild enough not to injure. Her tone splintered as the phrases tumbled forth, edged with desperation. "Did Caleb send you to drag me back? I'd sooner die than return with him." The gentleman remained motionless, unblinking. He merely elevated his palm slightly, open. "If I'd intended harm, you wouldn't be reclining on my surface at this moment," he replied evenly, his eyes steady. "Now, set that blade aside so I can halt your hemorrhage." No one had ever conveyed composure while cradling her fate in their grasp before, and that unnerved her almost as profoundly as Caleb. Something in his gaze prompted her to waver. Not fear, not anger, something ancient, like a recollection he shunned. She eased the blade downward gradually, her shoulders sunken in a reluctant trust. He fetched a rag soaked in liquid and cleansed the incision at her flank. The bite elicited her sharp intake, a gasp that echoed softly, but his contact stayed constant. Beyond him, the spread was hushed, only the gust and a remote horse breaking the quiet. Yet Rose sensed another element in that hush, something indefinable. And she hadn't a clue this serene gentleman harbored a history so shadowed. Whole settlements once murmured his name after dusk. But what action will Rose take when discovering the true identity looming over her surface? Elias labored in unwavering quiet as he bound the rag around Rose's flank. It was the sort of quiet that weighed substantial, not uneasy, but brimming with unspoken matters. Rose perceived it likewise. Each occasion his coarse digits grazed near her flesh, she detected a glimmer in his gaze. Something as if he had witnessed injuries like hers over and over again prior. Upon concluding the knot, she drew a deliberate inhalation and murmured gratitude, her voice faint and grateful. "Thank you." Her tone barely emerged. He inclined his head once, then drew forth a seat and saddled adjacent to the surface. His shoes groaned faintly in the grit. "You've got pursuers," he stated, his inflection staying serene, but the question bore gravity, his eyes searching hers. Rose gulped deeply. She recounted her sire's obligations, the thrashings, Caleb Price standing at her door with a band and a smile colder than iron. She recounted how her sire clutched the back of her gown and propelled her toward that individual, because forfeiting his acres terrified him more than forfeiting his offspring, her words spilling out in a hushed rush.
Elias attended without interjection. His mandible tensed just once. But she observed. The subtle clench spoke volumes. Upon her conclusion, he reclined marginally.
He exhaled a breath long retained, a quiet sigh of understanding. Caleb Price isn't a fellow who overlooks what he deems his possession, he warned, his timbre bearing a sharpness now, a subtle edge beneath, laced with quiet concern. Before Rose could inquire his implication, the echo of hooves wafted inward, leisurely, deliberate. Not a pursuit, more akin to a caller. An elder ranch hand entered the courtyard, brim angled rearward, powder on his jacket. It was Hank, a neighbor from the adjacent spread, a gentleman whose whiskers appeared aged beyond the barrier stakes trailing him. He discerned Elias and chuckled, a warm, gravelly sound. "Well, I'll be. Never figured I'd witness the day you'd tend wounds." Then he discerned Rose, and his grin dissolved swiftly, his eyes narrowing in worry. "Discord trails her. I caught word Caleb has fellows prowling the settlement seeking a young lass in a rented gown. You can imagine the sort he dispatches, the sort that boast of their deeds when no one observes." Rose tensed, her breath catching sharply. Elias fixed his gaze on Hank. "Did Price venture forth personally?" he asked, his voice low and probing. Hank rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "Not as yet, but he's agitated, truly agitated. And if he discovers her here, he'll unleash chaos upon any obstructing him." Hank hesitated. Then his temper sank to a murmur, laced with caution. "You certain you desire this turmoil? Elias, a gentleman with your background typically shuns notice." Rose elevated her chin. "Your background?" She posed it gently, her voice barely above a whisper, curiosity mingling with unease. But the instant the phrases escaped her, both gentlemen hushed. Elias fixed on the soil, as if he might inter there, the quiet, elongated sufficient for Rose to sense the down on her limbs prickle. What kind of gentleman had she entrusted her existence to? And if you'd care to continue this narrative, don't hesitate to tap subscribe, only if these instances resonate with you. Now brew yourself a steaming mug of tea and share with me the hour there and the spot you're tuned in from. For a spell, the spread seemed almost tranquil. Hank departed with a languid gesture, his wave lingering like a fond farewell. The powder settled in the courtyard. Rose reclined her crown against the timber surface, inhaling cautiously, her flank still tender from the gash. Elias maintained his seat proximate, limbs crossed, scanning the skyline like one anticipating a gale. He uttered little, but the burden in his gaze conveyed enough. Rose yearned to query him anew on that background Hank alluded to, but before her lips parted, something in the atmosphere shifted. A subtle quiver, a cadence. Hooves. Elias arose so abruptly the seat limbs scraped over the soil. "Remain silent," he commanded, his timbre descending low, steadfast, almost chill, his posture tensing like a coiled spring. He grasped his firearm as if it were an extension. 2 horsemen materialized through the swelt veil, both coarse fellows with inexpensive sidearms at their belts, the variety who serve one who never soiled his own grasp. They reined near the barrier and surveyed as if they already claimed the site. "We're seeking a lass," one proclaimed, his voice gruff and demanding. "Youngston, flowing locks, gown shredded, possibly injured? Spotted anything resembling?" Elias didn't flutter. "Merely bovines and powder here, no lass," he replied, his inflection even, almost indifferent, but his palm on the firearm spoke volumes even to the blind. The fellows traded a look, smirks fading into suspicion. They hadn't an inkling they were on the verge of clashing with the last soul on this plain they ought ever challenge. One dismounted and meandered toward the shed, his boots thudding heavily. Rose clamped a palm over her mouth to stifle a gasp, her heart pounding wildly. She strove to draw herself lower amid the fodder stacks. Her joint ached, her flanks seared. Every noise resounded overly. Inside the shed, the footsteps neared. Planks groaned. The fellow nudged a pail, glanced behind a compartment, then advanced 2 paces toward her refuge,
Before third, Elias framed the entry. His timber sliced the powder like a whip. He whirled, eyes widening in surprise. Elias clutched his limb, wrenched it, and dashed him against a support fiercely enough to dislodge grit from the beams, the impact echoing with a dull thud. The other horseman groped for his sidearm, fumbling in panic, but Elias discharged first. The report shattered the ether. The projectile grazed the edge of his brim and flung it from his crown, stirring powder as it hit the ground adjacent. The horseman stiffened, gaze broadened, palms quivering. That served as a cautionary discharge, and it landed impeccably, Elias added coolly. Though he didn't voice it out loud, the message hung in the air. For the first occasion, those fellows grasped this serene, modest spread posed greater peril than any tavern in Dodge City. The pair hastened to remount, both ashen, both rattled. One called as they bolted, his voice cracking with threat. "Caleb will know of this!" Elias depressed the firearm, his mandibles set, as he tracked their vanishing in a haze of powder. Rose regarded him, her breath snared. She had just beheld an alternate soul, far more perilous than anticipated, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. And now a solitary question occupied her thoughts. If this constituted Elias restrained, then what might unfold when Caleb himself reached the spread? The horseman had scarcely dissolved into the rippling swelt when the courtyard hushed again, overly hushed. Rose felt it in her breast, something approaching, something weightier than a pair of mercenaries. If you believe the nadir has passed, the frontier possesses a manner of disproving you. Elias ventured into the exposed blaze. He brushed his palms on his pants and fixed down the long soil path towards Dodge City. He spoke not a syllable. He required none. Rose felt the strain mounting in him like an old blaze rekindling in one who lived with danger as routine fare. Moments hence, another echo rolled over the meadow. Not a duo, a group this instance, methodical, purposeful. Caleb Price arrived, flanked by 3 armed retainers. His attire was overly pristine for this blaze, his smile overly assured for one who had faltered twice that same day. He stopped before the door and let his horse scrape the soil, as if the dust beneath belonged to him. Elias advanced one stride, no firearm raised, no anger, just that composed air Rose had gradually come to rely upon. Caleb cocked his head with that same icy smirk he wore when discussing possessions, his eyes gleaming coldly. "Produce the lass. She constitutes my entitlement and my recompense." Rose felt a fear arise, a shiver running through her. But before she voiced aught, Elias declared, his timber traversed the swelt like resolute rumble, unyielding. "She isn't an entitlement, she isn't a recompense, and she shelters beneath my eaves now." In that instant, Elias transcended mere rancher. He embodied a boundary in the dust that the whole plain could feel. One of Caleb's retainers murmured to him, voice low and urgent. Caleb's smile waned marginally, then further, his confidence cracking like dry earth. He at last identified the soul before him, Elias Boone, a name that once prompted brigands to yield pathways, a gentleman who did tasks for figures Caleb himself dreaded.
A gentleman Caleb held no cause to incite. Caleb gulped as another reminiscence struck, his throat bobbing visibly. He had once beheld a soul tender Elias a satchel of rail gold to resolve a rivalry. Untouched by any lawman, Caleb scrutinized Elias more intently, as if verifying, his gaze flickering with dawning fear. Then his timber faltered slightly as he breathed the moniker Elias once bore in the herd settlements. Black Hand Boone, the soul who rendered the double-cross crew evaporate in the frost of '79. Caleb knew the tales of Elias laboring for those who dominated the rails, the herd trails, and the wager dens, figures so dreaded that lawmen overlooked their forms. Elias hoisted his firearm sufficiently to permit the orb to gleam on the tube, not directed at any, merely recalling he erred not. A lone discharge struck the soil at Caleb's mount. The beast reared, whinnying in fright. Caleb nigh toppled, clutching the reins with white knuckles. And each of his riders halted, breaths held. Caleb gulped deeply. His timbre quavered just enough to reveal comprehension, laced with defeat. Retain her then. He wheeled his mount and departed with residual dignity, his posture stiff. His retainers trailed, keen to depart, casting uneasy glances back. When the powder dispersed, Rose exhaled protractedly. She had withheld overly long, her relief washing over her like a cool breeze. Elias regarded her gentler now, as if all tempests within had at last subsided, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You're safe here. None will arrive to claim you anew. And positioned there, Rose understood something straightforward, yet powerful. Elias glanced at Rose, his timbre subdued and sincere, a hint of wry humor in his eyes. Folks have dreaded my history for ages. Curious matter is, this day it saved you. Never imagined I'd express thanks for the elements I once sought to entomb. Before we conclude this segment of the narrative, share a thought. Would you have aligned with Elias in that courtyard, or would you have departed to avoid the clash? If this account stirs you, favor this presentation with a like, and ponder subscribing to catch the ensuing installment. Now brew yourself a steaming mug of tea, lean back, and inform me the locale you're tuned in from this day.